You are listening to episode 34 of the EU Startups podcast. Today's guest is Richard Mabey, the founder and CEO of Juro, a London-based scale-up which offers an all-in-one contract management platform. Hello everyone and welcome back to another episode of the EU Startups podcast. It has been a while since we published a new edition, since we've been very busy with the organization of this year's EU Startup Summit. The event was great. In total, we gathered over 2,000 founders, startup enthusiasts and investors, and we're already started working on next year's edition of the event. In 2024, the EU Startup Summit will be held on May 9 and 10 in beautiful Malta, and I hope to meet many of you there in person. Tickets are already available. And before we jump into the interview with today's guest, I'm excited to introduce our podcast sponsor. This episode of the EU Startups podcast is brought to you by Vanta, helping you scale security practices and automate compliance for the industry's most sought-after standards. To close and grow major customers, you have to demonstrate trust. But providing your security and compliance can be time-consuming, tedious, and expensive, especially for startups. Unless you use Vanta. Vanta automates up to 90% of the work for the most sought-after compliance standards like SOC 2 and ISO 27001 and gets you audit-ready in weeks instead of months. With Vanta, you get up to 400 hours of your time back and reach up to 85% in cost savings. And for a limited time, EU Startups listeners get $1,000 off Vanta. Just go to vanta.com/EU startups without a dash to get started. And now I'm handing over to my colleague Patricia and to today's guest.
Hello and welcome to another episode of the EU Startups podcast. And today we are joined by Richard Mabey, who is the co-founder and CEO of the UK-based legal tech startup Juro. It was founded back in 2016 to reinvent and to make the legal contract frictionless and accessible to everyone. And Juro has since grown pretty rapidly as it helps bring what I guess is a pretty rigid industry into the digital era. And, over the past year, the company has tripled its headcount. It's also, got offices in Riga as well as London. And there's a new hub in Portugal, soon to be opening in 2023. It's a company that operates on a remote basis. I think it's fair to say that Richard's been a very visionary leader behind the company's rapid success so far. So Richard, thank you so much for joining us. I'm really looking forward to learning more about Juro today and diving into some of the key philosophies and strategies that you have driving forward the company. So firstly, maybe you could tell us a little bit about Juro in your own words.
Great. Well, super happy to be here and thanks for having me on the show. So Juro is a contract automation platform. So we help businesses, generally speaking, fast-growing businesses, sometimes startups, sometimes scale-ups, to automate the processes around building, creating, managing, negotiating, signing, and tracking their legal contracts. So sometimes those are really simple contracts like non-disclosure agreements or sales contracts or employment contracts. Sometimes they're a little more complex than that, but we try to make that process frictionless. And in doing so, we help businesses to move faster because they can get the legal paperwork out of the way and get back to doing what they do best.
Okay, interesting. So it seems like it's a fairly, very important practice. Anybody who's had any interaction with business or any business person who works in a business knows interactions from businesses to other businesses. There's a lot of contracts to sign, a lot of people.
There's a lot of contracts, and no one quite knows how many contracts there are in the world, but we know that there are a lot, and we constantly try and estimate, and we sort of come up with these figures like 1 trillion contracts. But contracts are everywhere, as you say, right? And they're not just for lawyers. So I started out my career as a lawyer, so I spent a lot of time building contracts in the early parts of my career. But since then, as an employee, I've signed an employment contract. As a tenant, taking on a lease, I've signed a lease. Actually, everyone has contracts as part of their lives. And for businesses, the contracts are really central to the kind of core processes. So if you want to get any revenue, you have to sign a contract. If you want to hire any staff, you've got to sign a contract. If you want to take on any suppliers, you've got to sign a contract. So, we started thinking of contracts not just as paperwork, but this kind of foundational part of business. And the more we saw how archaic the processes are, which are typically, Microsoft Word documents being pushed around over email, the more we realized how much of an opportunity there was to actually speed up this process.
Interesting. So, as you said that you worked as a lawyer beforehand. So was there any inspiration or any key pain point that inspired you to jump on the entrepreneurial bandwagon and start your own company?
Yes, it was frustration more than inspiration, right? So I spent a lot of time actually doing this stuff. I think lawyers, there are a lot of smart lawyers out there who, train for years to do this really complex, problem solving work. And what they find is that actually a lot of the work of the day to day is pretty manual process. So I reckon at one point I was spending 3 hours a day on these super manual tasks like downloading files, uploading files, comparing files, right? So lawyers call this red lines. And it's called red lines because you used to send it by mail, and the lawyer on the other side would use a red pencil and then mark up the document, send it back, and then the other lawyer would use a blue pencil and send it back. And we haven't moved that far from that, right? We're still doing that. Even the track changes in the Word file looks like that. And there's still this email exchange, which incurs a huge amount of admin. So I think when I was in practice, I saw that and I thought, this is crazy. And then I wondered, well, why hasn't it been solved? Because so many of these core business processes like CRM have been kind of comprehensively solved. And all the while, legal is still, 10 or 20 years behind where the rest of the departments should be.
And so why do you think that is? Why do you think that the legal side of things has taken a little bit longer to catch up with automation and digital transformation, whereas in other spheres of life, it seems to be moving at a super rapid pace?
Well, I think one reason is that, it's only really been in the last probably 10 years where legal has started to reinvent themselves a little bit. So not in terms of technology, but in terms of their place in the business. So if you have an in-house legal team, the kind of traditional view of that team is this is the department who says no, right? They're a cost center, they're quite expensive, and they basically exist to block stuff. So you want to ship something on the website, they say no. You want to get a deal done, they say no. And I think that the smarter lawyers have done some amazing kind of thought leadership and work, which is trying to orient the legal function as a revenue driver. So, for example, if you have to get a commercial contract signed, the legal team can speed up the negotiation, can do that really, really well, and that can help push business forward. So I think that there's been a mindset shift, and that shift I think just took a long time to get there.
Yeah, I think that's quite an interesting point. I'd like to maybe get your thoughts a little further on that and how this, this reimagination of what exactly a lawyer is. And how they can support a business, how they can support people, rather than hold things back.
Definitely. Well, I think a lot of it is about human beings and not technology, right? So I think us lawyers, we're kind of risk averse by nature, which is good. You actually want your lawyer to be risk averse. You don't want them to be taking crazy risks, and rightly so. And they take on a lot of risk. They're professionals who have some practicing certificates, and there's a lot of liability and risk to deal with, right? So a lot of a lawyer's job is about trying to prevent things from going wrong. And sure. When I was a lawyer, I kind of reached deep into my soul and I said, am I actually the person who wants to, avoid things going wrong, or am I the person who wants to actually make things go right? And that was one driver behind me, becoming an entrepreneur. But I think for lawyers now, there are so many forward-looking lawyers who have made that mindset shift within legal, right? And so making things go right, all about enabling other teams in the business, creates much better human relationships. And if you have good human relationships, then the technology follows, right? Because, people want to automate, people want to use the software to do that.
Interesting. It's about, utilizing tech to support humans rather than hold us back. And I guess in the legal field, you're obviously very analytical thinkers and have the laws and the guidelines there. And instead of using them as a rigid this is how you have to do it, instead of using it as these are the opportunities and the ways we can make it work for us.
Definitely. And, I think the further I get in my career, the more I realize there's no great mystery about the legal profession. I mean, sometimes like scary when you look at these contracts and you sort of read, there's sometimes like capital letters in them, especially the American contracts. And they've got these archaic words, herewith, notwithstanding. And you think to yourself like, God, I'm not clever enough to understand this thing. But actually it's all kind of nonsense, right? And the really good lawyers will draft in like really plain English, short sentences, get to the point. And I believe this passionately, which is actually this should be accessible to everyone, right? It's actually one big part of our mission is opening up and democratizing this stuff, because, the sales contract is actually far more about sales than it is about legal, right? It's more to do with codifying a commercial relationship. And, we have a lot of fun in our kind of brands and with our community in thinking about this, which is like, how do you make law more human? Right. And we find these amazing champions in startups and scale ups, especially, but all over the place, who are on that similar mission. And Juro doesn't solve that for them, right? We play a small part, which is, we can streamline contract workflows. But we do whatever we can to support that, because I think it's right. And I think ultimately, anyone should be able to deal with contracts.
Absolutely. And I totally agree. I mean, I think the legal field's pretty famous, right, for its legal jargon and being not so accessible to the everyday person. Like, you need to have a big dictionary sitting beside you to understand some of the things sometimes. And, I think it's really interesting to see this approach to try and make it more accessible, to democratize the space for the good of people, because ultimately that's why the lawyers and the legal team is there. And so could you maybe share a little bit more about Juro's vision to do that? How exactly are you going about, as you mentioned there, helping startups and supporting startups and other scale-ups and companies who are going about this too in their contracts? Where exactly does Juro fit in the puzzle?
Our vision is to become the default way to agree terms. Right. So what's the status quo today? So basically what people do is they use Microsoft Word to create a template. They negotiate it over email using track changes. They save it as a PDF. They upload it to DocuSign. And once it's signed, they store it in Google Drive and might have, if they're really fancy, they might have an Excel spreadsheet called Contracts Register where they'll list out the contracts. That's what 99% of businesses are doing, more or less. So Juro says, well, we should be an all-in-one platform that replaces all of those tools. So to give you a kind of real example, if there's a commercial contract, we integrate with HubSpot and Salesforce. You just click a button, it pushes the relevant data from your CRM, contract gets generated. We'll go through workflows, approvals. It can be negotiated within the Juro editor. It can be signed with Juro Sign, and then it can be stored and tracked in Juro's repository. So the kind of core thing we do is we take 5 tools, condense them down into one. But the kind of exciting thing that unlocks and emerges is, well, it's a fundamentally different way of doing contracts. And, we've just passed a threshold of having processed 1 million contracts in this browser native way, which has never really been done before. So there's this brave new world emerging of, well, maybe we don't need files, all right? Maybe we don't need PDFs, we don't need Word. And there are certain advantages to doing so. I mean, some are very technical, like it means our editor can be very flexible and our integrations can be very deep. And some are relating to data, which is, one of the big problems with contracts is because they contain all those sort of weird legal paragraphs. It's very hard to get information out of them. Okay. So, what's the price? Who's it with? When does it end? And if you do that in a structured way using Juro, you get that data from the get-go. So there's also a data advantage to doing that. But in 10 years' time, we hope that we've reduced the number of documents that are being exchanged in these files and transferred them into the Juro browser native environment. And if we can do that, then we would have materially moved the world forward.
Of course, right. So it's quite a revolutionary process then, I would say.
It is. I mean, in legal, it's radical, right?
Yeah.
But legal needs, I think, does need significant change, and actually, lawyers want that change. The good lawyers want that change. And when we started Juro, we had a lot of haters who said, "Well, lawyers are never going to leave Microsoft Word." And that's true. Like there will always be some laggards who don't change their ways of working, but we now have 1 million contracts processed, so we are starting to see that shift, and we're starting to see even the more traditional lawyers saying, "Well, I'll give this a go because it, theoretically should be 10 times better than what I'm doing."
Yeah, absolutely. And I guess as well, there's always going to be doubters out there, and you have to go in and prove the value of what you're doing. And I think you've clearly done that quite well with having, as you say, 1 million contracts now through the system. So another interesting aspect to Juro is that you leverage this lawyer community. So could you maybe just tell us a little bit about that? What exactly is the lawyer community?
Sure. So we have a community of, I think it's now around 870 in-house lawyers. And it centers around a Slack group. And then there's a whole events program of online webinars, in-person events. And they're lawyers all throughout Europe. And actually 20% are now in the US. And really that community is for lawyers who are operating in uncertain scale-up environments. So usually at like really fast-growing companies that sort of say, after their Series B, gosh, we need a lawyer now. And the lawyer comes in and they sort of have this crazy job of handling all the risk in these companies and trying to figure out what's going on. And what our community does is it helps them to navigate that. So we have a whole stack of resources and materials on, how to run a 90-day plan if you're a GC, how to ensure that you can get started with the materials you need, and then peer-to-peer learnings. And I think for us, our community itself is a kind of advocacy of Juro as well. So we have people coming from the community and saying, well, actually, we'll give Juro a go as well. So it's been a huge thing for us, I think, over the last couple of years. And I think especially when you're doing something ambitious, just getting that incredibly deep understanding of the user is so vital. And the community has really helped us to do that.
Interesting. So you have these kind of two-pronged approaches. You're helping shake up the legal sphere with this tech platform, but also through this community. Have you seen any clear benefits of the community, or do you have any examples of how it helps support the wider startup ecosystem?
Sure. I think, one thing that we looked at really early was, well, how we're going to market Juro, which is something I guess all startups, in your community will face. And you can do it in lots of different ways, but we decided we wouldn't go and sort of plaster the London Metro with big adverts, and we decided that we wouldn't just kind of pay for Google AdWords. We decided that actually, if we create great content that our target users find valuable, then we believe it will pay dividends in the medium term. And so for us, as a business, we obviously get lots of customers from our community. It's not the main reason we do it, but we get lots of customers from our community. And that's led to millions in annual recurring revenue. But for the wider community, I think also the team here at Juro is just passionate about delivering this thought leadership, right? So there's a give back, which is, you can be a member of the community and you don't have to touch Juro, right? You can not be a customer. But it's important, and we get a lot of knowledge from our customers. We feel it's our obligation to go and share that in the world.
Great. So it's kind of like a knowledge hub as well, and to share and interchange ideas and perspectives, so you can keep developing, keep pushing forward this legal tech sphere, right?
Definitely, and I think for any startup, I'd really encourage any startup to look at that, which is, if you're building a business, you're going to have a target group of users. They might be, it might be a B2C thing, but especially in B2B, they tend to be the same kind of folks. So maybe they're like a revenue operations manager, or maybe they're in HR, or maybe they're in procurement. But you'll realize that your users are actually quite similar to each other, or they should be if you're selling a coherent product. And that means they've got all the same problems. And so what community can do is bring them together, and you can try and work through those problems, some of which may be related to your product and some may not. And the benefits, I think, to the company is, you get to learn way more than you would otherwise about the very people who you build for and who you sell to.
Interesting. I think it's a super important aspect, to brand identity as well, and also to create this kind of brand awareness, that you are aware of what your target audience want and what they need and their pain points, and you're prepared to be there to help them. And so beyond the contract automation side of things, are there any main pain points that you're seeing coming up through this community that you think that Juro could be on hand to help with in the future?
Definitely. I think, where Juro started was empowering like very routine contracts, right? So the really simple agreements, so, NDAs or employment contracts. And over time, Juro's offering has broadened a little bit, and that's been driven, I think, a lot by our customer advisory board, by our community. And an example of that would be, Juro is now set up to accept third-party contracts, so vendor contracts. So if you want to upload some PDF contracts that you've got sitting in a Google Drive, you can do that in one click. And again, this was just something we learned from the community. It's not necessarily kind of squarely in line with what we thought we would do, but it's something we just learned. That all said, that there are kind of limits, and I think one thing we believed in a lot at Juro is extreme focus. And so, like, we really want to become the absolute world experts at contract automation. And right now, for kind of legal teams and the teams they enable at scale-ups. And so, although we get tons of feature requests on, can you do task management? Can you do this, that, and the other? We basically say no. But what we do have is really robust APIs. So that means that people can connect into Juro and they can connect other tools with Juro. So like we are supported in Zapier's marketplace. So you can now connect Juro with like 10,000 applications. And so I think it's balance between specialization, but also the gentle nudges you get from your users. And if you listen to them, it will influence your product development.
Absolutely. And so you're using collaborative approaches then as well, alongside your community-based approaches, to kind of create this holistic overview to help keep pushing forward for scale-ups, which I think is really interesting. And of course, collaboration and community are two pillars really at the moment. We're starting to see just how important collaboration and community can be to not only the long-term success of the individual company, but also the wider ecosystem as a whole. And so in your mission to become global leader, so you were founded in London, in the UK, and you also have offices in Riga. And I think in 2023, you'll be expanding out to Portugal. Could you maybe give a little bit of insight into just what it's like to expand internationally, particularly whenever that tends to come with a lot of legal red tape, and you are a legal tech company. So maybe you could just give some insight into international market expansion.
Yeah, it's a really good question. So the world is not really ready for what startups want. Right? So startups want to just be able to work with smart people wherever. That's what we want. And when I co-founded the company with Pavel in 2016, Pavel's a Latvian national. So we just decided that we would split the company between Latvia and the UK. And I remember at the time, it's like one of my biggest mistakes is I remember someone said, well, I'm moving to Berlin. Can I still work for Juro? This is in 2016. I was like, I don't think you can. I'm not sure it's legally possible. And this was before all of these providers like remote.com and Velocity and the rest.
Well, before the pandemic happened and everybody kind of,
It was before the pandemic. So we've always done that. I mean, in recent times, we've built up a big remote hub throughout Europe. And we made the decision quite recently to double down on Lisbon, actually really Portugal as a country, and doing that using all the technologies that are available to streamline it. But even then, I think that the legal kind of differences country to country, like if you have an employee in a country or even a contractor in a country, are wildly different. And it's a complete minefield of legal risk. So the promise of, you can just do this everywhere is, I think, a little overstated. And I think, companies do really need to think country by country. So to give an example, would you right now want to have like folks in Russia? Like maybe not, due to the ongoing kind of situation in Ukraine. And certainly, if you're in that position, you'll see Russian nationals moving to other countries. And then you have to contend with, well, if they move to Turkey, is Turkey a country which, you want to like support a hub in? And then, of course, compounding that, you also have inflation. So you have, massive inflation in Turkey. You have huge amounts of inflation now in Latvia. So it's this kind of economic, legal minefield.
Yeah,
And
and
I did
geopolitical context as well to keep in mind.
totally. And I just wish countries would get together and say, look, let's agree that startups is a good thing. And let's agree that we all want smart people to get jobs in startups in our country and work remotely and try and harmonize some of this stuff because it does make it hard. And as a company, we would really want international talent.
So I guess, yeah, Juro, I mean, it's clear speaking to you, you're a fan of remote work and this approach. I mean, how many countries do you have teams scattered across at the moment? How many nationalities do you have? Do you know that off the top of your head?
It's probably something like 15 countries and 25 nationalities. That's what I'd guess. So it's a pretty international team, and I think it brings a whole diversity of perspectives that's really hard to get. I mean, I'm based in London, but I travel to our hubs, and it's hard to get the perspective we get from just one nationality. So we've kind of optimized for that. And I think it's also a little in the DNA of the company, right? So we were co-founded on a sort of remote basis between two co-founders in two different countries, which is kind of unusual at the time. And now, I hope that's kind of the norm.
And so for you as a remote going forward company, what are the core benefits?
Yeah, so I think there's two things, right? So one is flexibility. So I think, for Juro, we had to think about this like really philosophically about, because you start going down a rabbit hole of like, what does it mean to go to work, right? It used to mean in knowledge work that you would turn up to the premises and you would kind of sit there and, type stuff and whatever. And now that's shifted, right? So I think the opinion we've formed is what really matters is outcomes. So if together we can achieve shared goals and do it in the right way that's consistent with our values, then things like how long you spend doing it or where you spend doing it should be basically irrelevant. So we trust people to take responsibility because, we're adults, right? That we didn't employ any children. Everyone at Juro is an adult. Every startup's an adult.
That's good to know.
Right. So that's how like we start. And then over and beyond that, we try our best to harmonize benefits across countries. I mean, candidly, it's quite hard due to different regulations. But make sure that, everything about working in Juro is a coherent experience. And, we keep iterating at that. And we keep trying to overcome these jurisdictional challenges to make that happen. But whether someone is dialing in on a Zoom or is in one of our physical hubs, it just shouldn't matter. And we've taken that even into our leadership team. So when we have our weekly leadership team meeting, we have actually a majority of folks in London, but not everyone. And we all dial in on Zoom. And we do that to level the playing field. So you don't have, a room full of people and then one person on a screen. So I think you have to be very deliberate in making it work. But if you can make it work, the benefits I think are enormous. And, for me personally, I put my children to bed every night, and it would be really challenging for me to do that if I had a 1-hour commute to our hub every day.
Absolutely. And it really helps, I think, create, a better work-life balance, and you can better support your employees' mental well-being, I guess, in so many ways as well, by allowing a bit of flexibility and trusting your employees. I guess that also brings a lot of more positive energy into the team.
I think so. I mean, my opinion's always been when you're starting a startup, you're building two products, right? Like the one product is the thing you sell, and the other product is the company itself. Because what that is, you're basically defining it as if you're a product manager, right? So you sort of might imagine your employees are the users of this product, and there's this thing, and the rules and the shape of it, you are literally defining yourself. So you spend a lot of time trying to build the company like a product. And we have a fantastically good people and talent team who drive that. But it's something that's easy to forget, right? Because we're always obsessed with our targets and sales and product. And you forget that actually in the end, what is going to drive our success is having a really exceptionally talented group of people who feel well respected and supported and are in an environment where they can do great work. And that doesn't happen by accident. In fact, if you do nothing about it, it usually leads to a nightmare. And so I think investing a lot of time there has really helped us. And, our sort of employee NPS score, I think peaked at like 94, but it's always been pretty high. And, our voluntary headcount retention is 95% year on year. So that stability that you can bring through that thought counts for a lot, especially in a market we're going into in 2023, which is likely to be very, very unstable.
Absolutely. So you're really prioritizing the people behind the company who are the ones that are helping push forward the company and helping build on the success and help, support them in the way that makes best sense to them. And so I think for many companies, the idea of going remote and choosing this path, there's two, I guess, core challenges. One is kind of how you create this like team feeling, this team culture. Many companies will use the word culture. I'm not sure if I'm a fan of that. And the other is obviously dealing with, as we mentioned before, the jurisdictional challenges of hiring across borders, and if somebody wants to go move to another country, those sort of things. And I as you mentioned, you at Juro have really great employee retention scores. You have really good ratings for being a good employer. How exactly have you gone about, or what tips would you have in terms of creating this working environment that is supportive, that is positive to a team when you're not actually seeing each other face to face?
So I think there are three things that have helped us. I mean, we've obviously not got everything right, so take it with a pinch of salt. But I think the three things: values, rituals, and travel. So starting with values, the normal way values get built, in my experience, is the founders just like one day make them up. And usually you sort of see a slogan on the wall saying like, "We love teamwork" or something, and everyone's sitting there going, well, kind of, I like teamwork, but I don't know exactly what you mean, and I don't know where that came from. So I think being thoughtful in how you build values, which basically means having workshops with your team, identifying like non-aspirational commonalities in how you're operating well at that point in time, codifying them in a really simple way. So we have 4 values. So they're easy to remember, and then operationalizing them everywhere. So values come into our performance reviews. We celebrate an example of lived values every week in all hands. Even like to an extreme degree, our design team created a custom set of emojis, one per value, so that when someone shouts someone out, you can celebrate with a value-based emoji. So we're big on values. If you get that right, and this is being consistently enforced, like you're promoting great behaviors and you're saying, actually, this isn't okay.
Being consistent and intentional with it, yes.
Yeah, intentional is a great word, right? I think, because if you're not intentional, like, and you're accidental, like it just doesn't go well. So value is foundational, right? Then you have rituals. And I think rituals can be anything from all hands, right? Which is a thing that happens once a week. Can even be automations in Slack. For example, in Slack, we have we use a bot called Donut, which pairs people, and you might have seen it. And then it allows you to have a Zoom coffee with a random person in the company and not talk about work. So there's little things you can do around that. All hands as well, like run it well. So if you're making a meeting that people want to go to, then you have everyone there at least once a week, even if it's on Zoom. I've had a lot of negative feedback about my music choices in all hands because we start with 2 minutes of music at the beginning of every all hands, but people come, and that makes a difference.
It's better to get the conversation going with the bad music, I'm sure.
Yeah, exactly. And that moment when you land on a Zoom, there's like silence for the first 2 minutes. You've got 100 people on the Zoom. We've got rid of that awkward silence. So values, rituals. I think like travel is important still. So this year, for example, we took the whole company to Turkey. So we spent a week 3 days in Turkey. Some work, some non-work, but I can't get around the fact that I think human beings still interact really well in person, and you just have to take the effort to make that happen. So sometimes it's our engineering meetups, sometimes it's whole company meetups, but just making sure once a quarter, once every half year, whatever it is, you prioritize that time.
Interesting. So I'm kind of a very visual thinker. So I'm thinking it's like a tree. You have at the very base, you have your roots of your values, and then your rituals as it grows, and then you outsource into the travel opportunities where you can connect. And I think it's quite interesting. You're not taking away the opportunity for people to meet face to face and in person. And in fact, you're just enhancing it. And it's interesting to see how as well tech and different integrations can allow it to happen and really enhance the experience. Yeah, so just to wrap up this super interesting interview, I feel like I could talk to you all day on all these themes. as you are kind of really pushing forward the legal tech sphere with Juro, and we're entering into 2023, which is going to be an interesting year, I guess. What are your key predictions for the year ahead?
So, we spent a lot of time thinking about the macroeconomic picture, right? I mean, I suppose everyone is thinking about this. And, essentially we have a very toxic combination at the moment of high inflation and low growth. I think in the VC market, that has pretty much collapsed fundraising rounds. So I think companies that will thrive will need to be highly capital efficient. And I think we're just in a changed world, and some of that is good, right? So we're not seeing the crazy valuation multiples, the cheap money, the excessive burn. So I think getting extremely disciplined is something that some companies will do and some won't. I think those that will thrive. I think that those that won't, there'll be a huge number of startups that go bust because they have a reliance on funding and they will not be able to get it. So I think that there's a scary thing coming that startups need to be prepared for. I think the positive side to that, because I'm an optimist, the positive side to that is these are the times when great companies get built, right? So if you look at when Google got built after 2001, everyone said, well, this is a terrible time to start a company, and century-defining companies were created. So as long as you think about companies as a business, you remember revenue, minus cost equals profit, the thing we've all forgotten in the tech world. And as long as you continue to build great products for people and you're responsible, actually there's a world of opportunity next year.
Interesting. That's great. And I love that you have a nice optimistic outlook on it. I think that's really important. At the end of the day, challenges can breed opportunities.
For sure.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today. This has been a really, really insightful and an interesting conversation. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.